Welcome to Washington in Focus, your source for the week's top stories in the state of Washington. I'm Cole Lauterbach, managing editor for the Center Square Newswire service. This week, we'll be discussing what happens to the millions of dollars paid into Washington's state-run insurance program if voters allow residents to opt out of it. Speed bumps on the road to Washington's electric vehicle proliferation, Spokane's plan to limit sudden rent hikes, and a proposal in Seattle to allow the fire department to demolish abandoned buildings and how much that could end up costing taxpayers. That's ahead on Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach.
Do you care about classroom curriculum, transparency policies, and how your taxpayer dollars are invested in education, but you find it hard to cut through the partisan noise? Chalkboard News is bringing you straight news reporting on public K-12 education. We're talking news without spin. Chalkboard News publishes fact-based stories that make sense to parents, teachers, and readers who have skin in the game. Get this news delivered to your inbox for free by signing up at chalkboardnews.com. Subscribe today at chalkboardnews.com.
Welcome back to Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach. Now, let's jump into the headlines. Workers in Washington who file taxes with a W-2 are seeing a chunk of their salaries diverted to a state-run health insurance plan called WaCares. After a public outcry that the benefit wasn't worth the cost and other issues, voters put an initiative to give workers the chance to pocket some of that money. Capitol correspondent Carlene Johnson joins us with an intriguing question. If I drop out of the program, Carlene, will I get my money back?
Yeah, good question. Not getting an answer at this point, a clear one anyway, from the governor's office. But if in fact Initiative 2124, which is likely to end up on the fall ballot, is approved by voters and the Washington Care Long-Term Care Act is repealed, what about that money that, all of us have paid, or many of us have paid into the program for the last 9+ months, which, based on average salary, somebody makes $75,000, $80,000 a year, we've already paid more than $300 into that program. May seem like a small
per person, right?
Per person. And if this thing is, if the initiative passes and then I can choose to opt out, what's going to happen at that point? At that point, they will have had like a year and a half of me paying into the program. Will I get that check back from the government? Not likely at this point.
Seem to be tight-lipped about it at this point, but then again, I guess they're banking on this thing not passing. Now, when this program was being bandied about in the legislature and when it was ultimately passed, give listeners a little bit of a backstory into what the point of requiring it was.
Yeah, the point of it was that I guess most estimates are that like 7 in 10 of us will at some point need long-term care, whether that is us, going into a facility for assisted living, whether that's having somebody come into my home, to provide care, that sort of a thing. So 7 in 10 of us are going to need it. And most people, according to the state, were not making the investment in private long-term care plan. So the state was saying this is going to be a benefit to all of us, to force all of us to have some money taken from our paychecks. And the Department of Social and Health Services and the Department of Health, both big agencies here in the state of Washington, will be responsible then for keeping that money for us for a lifetime maximum benefit of $36,500. Now, anybody that has had a loved one in long-term care knows that's not going to go very far.
Right. And that was the thought too, is that, you spoke to a lawmaker who brought up that point, that this is, for $36,000, the cost today of long-term care on a monthly basis, he said that you're looking at maybe even a couple months, right?
Oh, yeah, that could be depending on the level of the care you need. I've had loved ones in, memory care facilities. And as that, disease progresses and they move from one apartment to the next where, they've got intensive care, that was gone honestly in 3 months for my grandmother. And this was 10 years ago. Costs have gone up exorbitantly since then. So, Representative Peter Abarno, I spoke to him this week. He was one who offered several pieces of legislation during this last legislative session that concluded in March, basically to allay some of people's concerns about this, to make it portable is one of the issues. Because at this point, you can pay into this program, and if you retire out of Washington state, as many people who would rather have sunshine do once they're taken, go to places like Texas, Arizona, Southern California, whatever. It's not portable. You will leave that benefit here in the coffers of the state of Washington and not get a dime of that when you leave here.
And it seems, though, it was very highly touted when it initially became law, and it reminded me of do you remember the involuntary retirement account programs that were really, really big back in the early 2000s, where it would be state treasurers would push for this, where they would say, people don't have retirements and they want to make sure that everyone, has at least something. And they started with these very small required, it was kind of an opt-out style retirement plan. But with Washington Cares, it seemed like once people started seeing that deduction come off their pay stubs, the tone appeared to change a bit.
Oh, yeah. It seems it's like so many programs that are sold or even election issues, right? Show up on the ballot. It's 58 cents out of every $100. It doesn't seem like much. Whenever you boil it down to pennies, it seems like pennies. And yeah, I'm not going to notice that out of my paycheck. And many Washington workers we don't even look at our pay stubs anymore, right? It's an auto deduct or auto, a deposit into our account. We don't even look at our pay stub to see the ding, 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 ding that's coming out. But people are starting to see it now. And by the time this initiative 2124, the potential opt-out repeal, is on the ballot, we will have paid into this program for almost a year and a half. And so for a lot of people, that's several $100s, if not more, depending on what you make for a living. And people are starting to see that's real dang money. And with inflation, gas prices, what they are in the state of Washington, I think there's going to be a lot of people looking at this with more scrutiny and maybe pulling up their pay stub to go, wow, look how much I've paid in. And I'm not planning on living here when I retire, or whatever the scenario is.
Exactly. The portability of it. Yep. And one thing that, and if you're reading your story, it was great coverage of this, by the way, the lawmaker made a wonderful point that I had not thought of, is this creates a false sense of security that, I've got money coming out of my account, so I don't have to worry about another savings account or another retirement fund or any other type of insurance after I retire if I need long-term care.
You're 100% right.
Was something that stuck with me.
Yeah, and Representative Abarno gave me the example of just his own kids. He's got an 11-year-old and a 12-year-old. Let's say they start working when they're 18 or whatever, okay? Pay into this program for a lifetime until retirement. They will have paid way more into the program than the max benefit of $36,500. Not to mention the fact that it's not going to be solvent. The program will be insolvent in 10 years based on, lots of different people running the numbers. And so the 58 cents out of $100 taken out of our paychecks, highly likely that would be going up in years to come to make the program solvent for the people that are going to be, drawing out of it.
Yeah. Sounds like Social Security, doesn't it?
Oh, this rings true. Yeah.
Tell anybody, talk to any millennial about that and you get an earful. But thank you, Carlene. We'll keep track of this as we approach the November election. Moving on, Governor Jay Inslee has made the phasing out of internal combustion engines a defining issue of his long career as governor of Washington. Part of that plan includes broad adoption of electric vehicles, to which the state is leading the nation in terms of the percentage ownership per driving population. Investigative reporter TJ Martinell dove into this effort. How's everything going, TJ?
It's not going as planned. It's not going as well as they would hope. There's different ways of looking at it, but where they are at and where they need to be, there is a huge chasm.
Well, where they're at, I mean, and I've seen two different metrics on this. One that the governor has touted, and it appears to be a real statistic, is that the percentage of electric vehicle ownership in Washington as a portion of all drivers is the highest in the nation. But you found there was another hang up, right?
Yeah, compared to other states, but other states are not trying to have only electric vehicle car sales by 2030. So they don't really have any reason to do this transition. That's the problem, is that they want to achieve this metric by a certain date. And even the Electric Vehicle Coordinating Council is saying these sales are high, but they're not as high as they could be because they don't have the charging port infrastructure that they need. And that's the big question right now, is they need to have a lot of charging ports, and they need to have them, within a certain mileage, like 50 miles, there's got to be a charging port every 50 miles. They're nowhere near that right now. And that's causing people to not want to buy an electric vehicle, because unlike a gasoline car, you don't have that reliability and that dependability, which is a big deal during certain parts of the year when there's extreme weather temperatures.
There's a gas station on every exit along the highway, but you're not going to find an EV charger at every rest stop. And there's anxiety involved with that too, where people, if they, say they want to drive from the Sound area to, say, Vancouver, they have to understand that there is a risk that they could find themselves on a long stretch of road and be low on battery. Not different from with, gasoline powered vehicles, where there, stretches of road out in the desert where there might not be a gas station for the next 100 miles. But at the same time, it's much more prevalent with EV charging. But TJ, just how far behind is the state in setting up these EV charging stations? You said they want them every 50 miles.
Yeah. So they have like several, we're talking like 5,000 public charging ports in the state. And they're going to need, now this is public and private, but they're going to need 3 million combined public and private charging ports to make this 2030 goal feasible. So they've got a lot of work to do, and it's going to cost. The other issue is the cost and how they're going to pay for it. It could be as low as 2.7 billion. It could be as high as 7.4 billion, according to their estimates. And even EV Council have said, but that's just the base cost. There's other costs involved in the installation, construction, maintenance, preservation, all that, and upgrading. So this is going to be the big question, is if we get to the point where you are legally not allowed to buy any other car than an electric, and they don't have the infrastructure in place, what are they going to do?
Right. Well, and you made a good point there too, is that in terms of the cost, very much like broadband, these cables, these charging stations aren't just set it and forget it. You don't just have to pay to put them in and then you leave them there. There's the cost of maintenance and upkeep for these, thousands upon thousands of new charging stations all over the state. And one issue that we've seen nationwide, but also in Seattle and other metro areas, is the vandalism of these EV charging stations.
And this is going to be a huge problem, because right now there's not a lot of charging ports. But what happens when you have a lot of them, and it makes the financial incentive to steal them more enticing? But on top of that, you have cars that are now more and more vehicles, more and more drivers that are dependent on these ports in order to travel. Without these ports, especially in key sections of the state, if you take out enough charging ports and completely knock out a station through theft, you could paralyze traffic flow through that area. And that's also going to be
highways, right?
Yeah. And that's also going to be a big deal if they decide to hit trucker charging stations. They're going to need the best and the fastest type of charger. And that's probably going to involve more copper wiring. And so those are going to be targeted as well. So this raises a lot of significant infrastructure security questions.
Can't wait to hear your follow-up on that one. That's going to be a great story. Thank you, TJ. Washington law requires 60 days notice before a landlord can increase rent on a tenant. The city of Spokane is mulling over a plan to increase that notice period. Joining us for the first time is Eastern Washington reporter Tim Klauser. Tim, what are the specifics of the proposed ordinance?
This ordinance takes a step further than the current state mandate of 60 days that you had mentioned, and instead requires a minimum of a 120-day written notice before implementing any rent increase of 3% or less. That written notice period increases to 180 days for anything over that 3% threshold. This ordinance is not going to affect any written notices for subsidized housing, since that rent is based on the tenant's income.
Right. That's more means tested. Yeah. Now, what was in the conversations for this ordinance? What's the justification for extending that notice period to well beyond the 60-day mandate that the state has?
Yeah. So according to data in 2022, around 21,000 households in Spokane are cost burden, and that accounts for around 90% of Spokane's renters. So being cost burden just means that you're spending more than 30% of your income on rent. So in response to that, the city's trying to take measures like with this written notice period extension to sort of control rent in any means that they can. For the past few years, Washington State has had a preemption against rent control. But as a part of that, they added in that 60-day requirement period for notifying tenants before raising their rent. So this kind of just takes a step further. Other areas in the state have done it as well, such as Seattle and Tacoma. So it's not entirely unique to the Spokane area, nor do they expect any challenge from the state on it.
And we've seen, like in Seattle, Tacoma, even as well, we've seen rents nationwide as a side effect of home price explosions go up, and people being locked in their homes because they refinanced in 2020, 2021 at like 3%. And the prospect of a new mortgage that could possibly double their current one means that they're going to take a beating on a new home. That in macro stagnates everything nationwide. I mean, if people are not simply not moving out of their starter homes because they can't afford that jump in the interest rate, they're not gonna. And so what is specifically zoom in as what is Spokane seeing?
What Spokane is seeing is those the cost of rent is relatively going up with the rest of the state. While it's lower than the state, vacancies are right on par with the rest of the state. So even when rent is out of control for a certain tenant and they can't afford that increase, they likely can't afford to move on to the next place with vacancies so high. So as a result, homelessness is going up, and those properties that are available are being picked up by larger corporations that are taking care of even the smaller aesthetic upgrades that those homeowners that previously had them can't afford to make for renters.
And you mentioned homelessness. The proponents are saying that the rent increases that these people are seeing with short notice are leading people to become homeless because they simply they're claiming they don't have anywhere to go after that because of the lack of housing options.
Yeah. So with the housing market being so stressed in the Spokane area and vacancies so high, rent is going up across the board. It's not just a few properties. So these tenants are really faced with the option of figure out a way to pay that increased rate or move into a smaller place for maybe the same amount of money, or into a place that's the same size for more money. So there's just not a lot of options for renters right now in the Spokane area.
Right. Well, and the cure to demand is obviously supply. And what is in terms of red tape to putting this up, the state has removed some of the barriers to building more affordable housing. But that's a long-term solution, to a problem that needs, short-term addressing, as the proponents have said. But opponents of this proposal spoke up at this hearing that you covered and said that extended notice would actually make matters worse in the short term, right?
Yeah, they were pointing to a few different studies. It's just hard to say with a lot of these ordinances being so new and so much happening with housing across the state. I know that they are trying to make it easier to build more affordable housing in the Spokane area. But this is all just part of the challenges that Spokane's new mayor is tackling after only taking office around 100 days ago, and also a topic that she plans to address coming up next week when she does her first State of the City address on Tuesday. So I plan on waiting until then to hear more about this, and as well as Monday when they vote on the ordinance during that evening city council meeting.
Thank you, Tim. Welcome to the team. Moving it back into Seattle, supporters of a proposed ordinance in Seattle hope it will solve their issue of abandoned buildings burning down. The novel approach turns the city's fire department into a demolition crew of sorts. Seattle reporter Spencer Pauly joins us. Spencer, what's the initial premise of this idea?
So the premise of this idea came from Seattle Mayor Bruce Harrell. It's an emergency legislation that would amend the Seattle Fire Code to allow the Seattle Fire Department to conduct demolition of unsafe vacant buildings within the city limits. It's intended to be used as a last resort for the city to rid of these buildings which they deem dangerous.
No, I don't go to Taco Bell for pancakes, Spencer. In terms of the fire department demolishing a building, is this just some side talent that all fire departments have? I'm so confused about this. But you can't deny, though, that the issue of buildings catching fire in Seattle has become pretty bad in terms of data you found, right?
Exactly, yeah. So in the last 3 years, there have been a concerning number of fires in vacant buildings throughout the city. In 2021, there were 77 vacant building fires, 91 in 2022, and 130 in 2023, 3 of which included fatalities. Now, through April 15th, there have been 30 fires in vacant buildings so far this year. And that's just on pace to keep these trends going, which is just alarming to the city.
And what I'm seeing also, too, is the stories about why these buildings are catching fire is because they come like de facto drug havens, where people will start fires because they're, cooking drugs or they're, smoking different types of meth or crack or things that require fire to smoke or ingest. Or
it's that too, for sure. And the Seattle Fire Department Chief Harold Scoggins mentioned that a lot of homeless people just shelter in these places and build fires, and that's kind of
there's no heat.
Yep.
Yeah. The cost, though, and this was interesting to me because it's the cost being handed to the property owner. That, to me, I see as a taxpayer protection, because you don't want to have to just demolish this on the taxpayer dime just because a private property owner cannot keep their property from becoming a slum property. But you found that there might be an issue where that money isn't going to show up right away, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So for context, the city would have to contract with vendors to conduct this work. The Seattle Fire Department wouldn't be the ones, getting the wrecking ball, demolishing these buildings.
Oh, okay. Well, that seemed much more fun. But, all right.
With this, if the fire code is amended, costs associated with these contracts could range from $350,000 to $500,000 this year. Legislation says that these costs would be pushed to the property owners, who are associated with these demolitions. They would have to reimburse the city for these costs. So the property owners would pay for these. There's just one issue. The department doesn't hear from a lot of these property owners.
Right.
They're hard to find. Chief Scoggins mentioned some cases the property owners don't even live in the country, so they're very hard to contact. So that causes some issues. So when a property owner doesn't pay up, the city will have to place a title lien on the property to cover abatement work costs. Now, a fiscal note for this legislation mentions that revenues may not be received in a timely manner, so we require a multi-year support for this bill until reimbursements are received. And I quote, "There is no guarantee of financial recovery." So far, it doesn't look like we're going to see these property owners pay directly up front, but in some capacity, we're going to see these vacant buildings at least torn down before they catch on fire and cause more damage.
Right.
I think is what.
Well, and the one thing this reminds me of, Spencer, and I think we had talked about this, is the city of Detroit did a blight program where they would put the liens on these properties in more rundown parts of Detroit where you had a bunch of abandoned buildings. Mm-hmm. They would knock them over, and then the city owned them at that point.
Yep.
And they would then sell those properties off. And I'm curious, it makes me wonder, if that's going to be the norm. Thank you, Spencer. Appreciate it. We will track this one as it moves its way through the city's ordinance process. And a big thank you to our journalists for sharing their stories today. Stay up to date with these and more at thecentersquare.com. I'm Cole Lauterbach. And until next time, this has been Washington in Focus.